From the Toronto Star, I'm Raju Mudler, and this matters. MZO is the acronym that communities across the province have come to fear. It stands for Ministerial Zoning Orders, and through their use, the provincial government has upended the planning process across Ontario in a number of cities and towns, often approving projects that don't sit well with the residents. Now residents are starting to fight back, getting organized to try and stop what has been called the bulldozer of planning. Noor Javed is a Star reporter covering municipal politics in the 905 and has been following MZOs for a while. She joins us to discuss how a community may have come up with the playbook on how to combat them. Noor, thanks so much for coming back on the show again.
Thanks, Raju. Thanks for having me again.
Okay, so Noor, I really want to talk about the community activism that is springing up across the province in terms of fighting these, but I do think we have to first recap what this is all about. What exactly are Ministerial Zoning Orders, or MZOs?
So they sound very boring, but I find them very exciting. So Ministerial Zoning Order, it's basically this power that the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing, who is currently Steve Clark, he has this overriding power where he can go in and rezone any parcel of land in the province to whatever he chooses. So he can rezone an agricultural parcel to residential housing. He can rezone provincially significant wetland currently to, a warehouse. So it's this power that the minister has to basically rezone land however he chooses.
Now, these are kind of designed as tools of last resort, right? They're supposed to break planning gridlock, which, over controversial things can take years and years. But I think the key point here is that previous governments have really used them sparingly, but this government has actually used them much more often and in a number of sort of controversial circumstances, right? Is that fair to say? And can you tell us a little bit about how they've been using them?
Yeah. So they were used under the Liberals, but I think the last I read that they were used maybe in 15 years, they were used maybe 15 or 16 times. So maybe one a year or a few a year. And in the past, they were used to settle really contentious kind of lawsuits or other kind of land disputes, or they were used to expedite development in certain jurisdictions. The current government has issued 37 MZOs since 2018. And this year has been like the bulk of them. I think 30 of them at least have been in this year. So that's like just the sheer number of them. The government will say, well, these are really necessary. They are helping us getting more long-term care beds. They're helping us getting more affordable housing. They're helping, spur the economy during COVID when we need the economy to improve. But like the vast majority of people, including many municipalities, are looking at them with concern that they are bypassing the normal processes that have existed for 50, 60 years, that, there's a process to planning, right? There's an application that comes in, a council will study it, the staff will study it, residents will take part and they'll voice their concerns or their support of it. And then there's discussion with the developer. And it's a long process. It's a long, expensive process with lots of lawyers. But, you can argue has it worked or not, but that's what the process has been. And so these zoning orders basically comes in and takes away that entire process and basically allows development where development wasn't really allowed before. Like some of the most contentious ones that we're seeing now are, areas that are provincially significant wetlands or woodlots, which in previous years when the TRCA, that's a whole other story, but when the conservation authorities had more authority, they would have said, these development here is not allowed at all. But these MZOs overturned that. They overturn any kind of restrictions and they allow development basically anywhere.
Now, the other thing I wanted to say is that these things are pretty widespread across the province right now. We've had a couple in Toronto and they really are across the 905 right now. So there are a number of fronts that these have been used recently, right?
Yeah, they're obviously in the suburbs. They're in other parts of Ontario. They're in Northern Ontario. They're all over the province. We're seeing them everywhere.
And I think the other key here is that there is no application process. So there is no process to revoke them, right? Nothing that is set that you can actually fight these things, right? At least officially.
There is no process that I have seen yet to revoke them. The only process to fight them, it seems to be currently, is a grassroots process with citizens, speaking out about them or protesting them.
Stop the demolition! Stop the demolition! Stop the demolition!
Or as we saw in the downtown case with the Foundry lands, it's going to the courts and getting it stopped, but not even stopped. I mean, just paused. So there really is no process in terms of actually getting them revoked that I have seen currently.
Well, this brings us to the great piece that you recently wrote about Stratford, which obviously everyone knows is the home of the Shakespeare Festival. But up until very recently, it was also supposed to be the planned home of a new glass factory. And I think this is going to sort of illustrate a little bit of what you're talking about, the people there and the grassroots movement that has sort of tried to fight against us. Tell us what happened there, please.
So just to start, there are so many MZOs and all of them are very unique in their own ways. And Stratford has a lot of very interesting parts to it. The Stratford situation started last fall publicly when the city of Stratford announced that it had a deal with this glass factory. The company is called Chenille, to bring in this huge, I think 2 million square foot glass factory in Stratford that would basically provide glass for probably most of Canada, because I think this would be the only glass factory of its kind in Canada. And so in November, there's a meeting posted online about how there's going to be a cost sharing discussion that the public can take part in. So this would be like how much Chenille is going to input into the infrastructure and how much the town is. So the residents are looking at this and they're like, we never heard about this glass factory. Where did this glass factory come from? How did it get approved? Where are the environmental studies? And so residents at that point found out that an MZO had been issued by the province for this glass factory, and specifically for this glass factory, not for any industrial thing, just for this glass factory. And so residents were shocked because the backstory of this glass factory is that it actually had tried to go through the correct process in the township of Guelph-Aramosa, which is north of Guelph. And it was unable to be approved by the council there because so many residents were upset about it. They were concerned about the environmental impact. They were concerned about how much water it would use. And so it had already failed somewhere else in the province. And so all of a sudden it shows up in Stratford, and these residents were just really, really upset. And they started to organize and they started to probe and try to get answers to the questions that the town wasn't feeding them. And they actually connected with the people in the Guelph-Aramosa township about how do we organize around this. And this is during COVID. So they had Zoom meetings and they started having socially distant protests and rallies. And they started really pushing the council for answers and started digging into FOIs. And they really got organized to the point where the town realized that they couldn't just push this through. And so there was supposed to be a big meeting in the fall to finalize this deal. And the council at that time decided to push it out, just saying, we need more time. And then January came and then they said, it's COVID. So we need more time to have this discussion. And then Chenille put out a press release saying that they're suspending this project indefinitely because they're upset about the timeline. And so a lot of residents have looked at that and said, we won. Maybe we've won this thing because this company doesn't have the patience to stick around. And from what I've heard, the town, I don't think they really realize the uproar that it would cause. From what I've heard, 75 to 80% of the residents of this town were against this project. And so I think the council saw the writing on the wall. And, the residents even went to the lengths of sending in mailers to council saying, I will not vote for the person that votes for this in the next election. They really put pressure where I think politicians feel pressure. And so they basically, from what we've seen, the MZO is still there. And the town hasn't really confirmed their position. I keep saying town, it's actually City of Stratford. I apologize, Stratford. City of Stratford. They haven't clarified their position. By what it looks like, this project is pretty much dead.
Okay, Noor, I want to unpack a couple things there. One of the things that I find really interesting about MZOs is that they can be and often have been requested by the municipalities to speed up the development. And what I found amazing in your story is that, when you talk to the mayor of Stratford, he says he regrets jumping that process. Now, let's talk about that. What do you think other municipalities can learn here? Because obviously the mayor and the council made the decision because they thought it would benefit the area, but clearly did not take the feelings of their constituents into play, right?
So I think, the mayor of Stratford, he basically asked for this MZO multiple times. I've seen this in the letters and this has been recorded publicly. Even the government said, well, they asked us so many times. So he made the mistake of not even having a discussion on MZOs in public. He had the discussion in camera and then he asked for an MZO. So he he really, made a big mistake in terms of not even bringing this issue out into the public, because he was asking for this MZO in 2018, from what the letters I've seen. So before MZOs even became a big thing. So I don't know if he didn't know the process or no one clarified, you got to bring this into open. Who knows what he was really thinking. So I think he regrets the way that he has gone about it. And he did also say to me that, I realize now that if we had just followed the proper process, it probably wouldn't have been this controversial at all. Like it probably wouldn't have even been approved. You know what I mean? Who knows? But the big thing that really upset people was the secrecy, the way that it was done. That's what really riled up the public. That here's this mayor asking for MZOs, here's all these backroom deals happening. And then we find out at the end. And that, the residents have said that, that was the two things. Like one thing is that there was so much secrecy. And the second thing was there's COVID and nobody had anything else to do. They wanted to know more about this project, right? And they were willing to pay attention because this became a big thing. So I think the mayor did say that, he regrets that it wasn't a much more public process. And I feel like a lot of municipalities are feeling that way. I feel like they do feel like there is this sense through MZOs that decisions are being made in secret. Municipalities feel like this too, right? Like some municipalities have talked to us, the mayor of Aurora has said that when there was an MZO issued in his town, he didn't even know about it because it was on provincial land. So there is this sense that these deals just don't happen anywhere. They happen somewhere. They're conceived, right? There's someone talking to someone. And so I think there is this sense that there is a secrecy element to MZOs. This is why I think people are so intrigued by them, right? It's who is paying for this development or who is pushing this development and who is talking to who's lobbying, the government for this development. So I think there is now this demand from residents for more transparency. And even some municipalities are asking for transparency. So I think what the Stratford mayor is thinking and what he has said publicly about maybe regretting this MZO, I think other municipalities are looking at it and will hopefully learn from it.
We'll be right back. Okay, so the lesson here, though, is it basically grassroots activism that holds local politicians highly accountable? Is that sort of the way that you can sort of beat these because there is no other way to really upset them, overturn them?
Yeah, I think the public voice is really important. I think largely from my coverage of the 905 for the last 10, 15 years, when I've seen that when the public gets involved, it really spurs change. I have found that, in any government, but really in the suburbs, in the 905, I find that when the residents organize and when they ask, when they push for things and they push for change, oftentimes that public pressure works. Everybody wants to win the next election, right? Nobody wants to be pushed out. And so we're seeing that in many places now around Greenbelt related issues that residents are organizing and they're pushing councils, which are largely used to having no attention on them. And the councils are kind of getting nervous. And we are seeing, I would say, a little change. It's not so significant that, the MZO will be canceled and this and that. I mean, you have to look at the government has pressure from all sides, right? They have pressure from the residents, but they also have pressures from the development industry. And so they're trying to find a balance. But I think the point is the residents need to be aware and they need to care. And as Stratford has shown us, the public pressure can work.
You mentioned the Greenbelt. Let's talk about some of the environmental concerns. There's also wetlands in Pickering that people are protesting, and then there's a lot of talk about the Greenbelt and whether or not these MZOs are going to affect there. Can you just talk broadly about some of the conflicts that are happening right now with that?
Yeah. So, the MZO in Pickering, I've written about that earlier. It's very controversial because that is a provincially significant wetland, which before the government started to really push these MZOs, a provincially significant wetland or woodlot would have been off limits to development. It still really currently is. It's supposed to be off limits to any kind of development. But what has happened is that there was changes to the Conservation Authorities Act last year, which was quite controversial. And at that time, the government's basically said that when there's an MZO issued, even if it's on any kind of sensitive land, it can be developed. And so that is the situation there. But the thing is, the government will always say, you know what, we're developing and we're giving MZOs, but we're never going to touch the green belt.
The amendments pertaining to enhancements of the MZO authority are not applicable in the green belt. Full stop.
So the green belt is like this swath of land that is 800,000 hectares. And it's basically around the Greater Golden Horseshoe. And that is this land that basically years ago, the government said that we're not going to develop on this land. And so the Ford government has always held fast that we're not developing on it. We're not touching it. You know, there was a video leaked years ago with Doug Ford was talking to developers and saying, oh, we're going to open it up.
We will open up the green belt, not all of it. We're going to open a big chunk of it up, and we're going to start building and making it more affordable and putting more houses out there.
Since then, there was so much backlash after that video came out that since then, they've clarified all the time that we're not touching the green belt. But that doesn't mean that everything else that's sensitive, that's not in the green belt, can't be touched. And I think that's the thing, you know, like they are touching all the other things that they can't touch. They're not just touching the green belt. So I think that's just important to clarify. And so all of those things are related because there's so much development pressure in the 905, right? And there's so much pressure to develop in areas like, for example, Richmond Hill. The town of Richmond Hill has no space to develop anymore. Their land is done. So all they can do is either have infill, or they can develop, you know, condos, or they can try to push the government to open up the green belt that they have. Those are the three options they have. So there's so much pressure these municipalities are feeling. And so basically that in a nutshell is like the overall issue. But today, for example, the province said that they want to expand the green belt and they're going to have consultations and they're going to have discussions on the green belt. And I think they're talking about these things because I think they're seeing that people really care about this issue, probably more than they expected. They're getting a lot of bad press because all we're hearing about are MZOs and, you know, the lack of public voice and infrastructure projects that are going to destroy the green belt. And so it'll be interesting to see as a result of this consultation, like what is included in the green belt, like where is that land? What is the quality of that land? So I think a lot of people will be watching to see, are they just saying it as like, you know, damage control, or do they actually mean it?
What about the impression that these specifically help developers and that this government potentially is in the back pocket of those developers and in using these things? What do you have to say to that?
I think that there is this sentiment that, you know, ever since Doug Ford came into power through the support of Ontario Proud, which was a advocacy group that was made up of mostly developers, that I think that there is this sentiment that, you know, this government is propped up and supported heavily by the development industry. And so I think when you look at all these MZOs and, you know, recently there's a whole discussion about this GTA West Highway, which is, you know, going to connect Vaughan to Caledon, through Caledon to Brampton. People are asking the question, like, who is driving these things? Who is pushing this? If the people don't want it, if the municipalities really don't want it, but they're saying they're going along with it, like who's pushing it? And so I think there's this idea out there, and we have seen kind of stories and the provincial NDP talking about developers who have, you know, supported the Ford government, how they're now benefiting because it's their projects that are getting approved through MZOs and it's their projects that are being pushed through. Benefiting. Yeah, exactly. So when you look at different situations, you have to wonder like who really is going to benefit. And I think as the NDP has shown, if you kind of track this, you can see that there are connections in terms of who funded who and maybe who is benefiting now.
Well, Noor, I think a lot of us are doing that because of your fantastic reporting on this.
Oh, thanks, Reggie.
And so there's a ton of moving parts to this. Last question, what are you following next? Where do you think this is going and where is it heading and where should we be paying attention?
Good question. So I think one of the big pieces right now that people are really, really interested in are these highways that are being built. And this one, the GTA West Highway in particular, that's going to be connecting Vaughan to Brampton. There's a lot of interest in how that highway goes because from what people say, this will cut through basically the largest swaths of the Greenbelt in the GTA. And also this highway was conceived like 20 years ago. And so people are wondering, like, do we have a need for it? Why don't we just bring transit? So that highway, and also there's one up in East Gwillimbury, is also very contentious. And those are two very interesting ones that people are watching very closely. Recently, the government also discussed this idea of an enhanced MZO. And so they asked municipalities to give their input on like the idea of an MZO where basically the province would not just obviously issue the MZO, but they would control everything about this development. So currently, municipalities are the ones that control the site plan. So they'll control like, okay, where are the roads connecting? How is this thing going to look? Where's the lighting going to be? The sidewalks? That's controlled at a very micro level by the planning department of any municipality. That's what you would expect. But the province said, hey, in the instances of where MZOs have been issued, how about we take control over the site plan so that we have full control? So this is really interesting. The feedback ended January 31st. And I only read 3 or 4 reports from different municipalities in the GTA, and all of them resoundingly said, no, please do not take away this last little bit of control that we have. And so it'll be interesting to see what the government says.
Noor, we're doing a talk about how we can fight these things, and now you've come up with the movie villains. Like, we've beat the one bad guy, and now there's a new big bad that all of a sudden came out of nowhere. So
Yeah.
I think we're probably going to have you on again if something happens with these enhanced MZOs, which I'm sure people are probably going to freak out about. Noor, I want to thank you so much for your time and your expertise on this topic.
Thanks so much, Raju.
Noor Javed is a Star reporter covering municipal politics in the 905. That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Raju Mudler, Adrian Chung, and Saba Etisas. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.